Good evening and welcome to Cooperative Vermont. I'm Matt Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
And we're coming to you live from VCAM Studios this Sunday, May 4th, 2014. And we have a couple of interesting topics we're going to be hitting on tonight. First, we'll be hitting the news, and then we'll be talking about basically the crisis in democracy at Vermont Federal Credit Union and some of the implications of that and kind of how it reflects some larger troubling trends. And then we'll be concluding with a more happier story about the organizing going on right now in Burlington to create a co-op brew pub along the lines of the Black Star Pub and Brewery in Austin, Texas. But first, the news.
Cooperative Vermont held its, in the time since our last episode, Cooperative Vermont held its first social circle event in Barrie on April 16th. And Granite City Grocery co-hosted this event. And it's the first of many that we hope to be doing in different parts, different regions of Vermont. It was a great event. There were some core Cooperative Vermont people there, as well as a lot of members of Granite City Grocery. So there was this cool intermingling there of some different groups and getting to know what each other were up to. Mm-hmm. And Chris Riddell from Granite City Grocery gave a great explanation of what Granite City Grocery is doing and why they're doing it.
Yeah, and I think we've got a picture from that event that we can show. But Chris really, I think, did a good overview of their organizing process. And this event for them, for us, for Cooperative Vermont, was kind of the first of this tour of events that are the goal is to have them happen around the state, bringing together the local co-op community, mm-hmm. And sort of introducing people from different co-ops and different sectors to each other. Right. And for Granite City Grocery, this event really served as a kickoff to really what for them is a summer of organizing. They're in the process of hiring a part-time organizer to really sort of be able to kind of put the energy. They've got several volunteer committees. They've got a lot of committed people, but to have someone for whom it's their day job to be really doing this is going to be really putting things another step forward. With the goal of recruiting, getting to 600 members by June 30th, they've put out. And I've been noticing on their social media stream a steady stream of welcomes to new members. So already this campaign's been really showing results. So they're doing some really impressive organizing down there. And
the other another interesting thing to note is the event was sort of based around Principle 6, cooperation amongst cooperatives. And it was interesting to see there, Hunger Mountain had some employees there. And when Chris was talking, the general manager of Hunger Mountain also was on there helping to sort of organize. And it really underlines the difference between competitive, for-profit institutions and cooperative institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've actually received a grant from Hunger Mountain Co-op to help them in their kind of initial organizing phase, which you pretty much wouldn't see in the for-profit sector.
Right.
Yeah, and their folks, the event was sponsored by a number of local co-ops, again, kind of showing that support. So like Members Advantage Credit Union, Community Credit Union, Cabot. I think it was also Hunger Mountain.
Hunger Mountain, yeah.
So they brought together a number of co-ops, both in terms of like supporting them in this event, but also just in general supporting their organizing process.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, and similar, another food co-op seems to be really kind of the rubber is hitting the road for them is Morrisville Morrisville Co-op.
Right.
They had a big recent event, kind of kickoff event, and they also hired a membership recruitment coordinator, kind of very similar role as what Granite City Grocery is looking for. So
that's. It's very cool to see these projects, growing throughout the time we've been doing the show. We've sort of been following both these projects. Mm-hmm. It's cool to see them progress and become closer and closer to reality.
Yeah. And so the social circles were the committee that's been kind of working on organizing them met again last week, and we've got a couple of possible leads. Including one thing that there was actually just a recent 7 Days article profiling a cooperative movie theater in Randolph, Vermont. And so we've been in touch with them to talk about maybe in the fall doing a film screening with a co-op related movie. but also might be going down south in southeastern Vermont for an event. But really the idea is to have these all over the state because we want to really build this sort of statewide community. So that's exciting. And then also sort of along similar lines, the Cooperative Vermont Steering Committee has been meeting consistently every 2 weeks and is working right now on a survey that's going to go out to all co-ops in the state with the goal of bringing in a bunch of statistical information to be able to both kind of really get an accurate assessment of the impact, economic, et cetera, like all the different types of impacts that co-op movement has in Vermont, how large it is, how important it is to the economy, and also sort of to get a sense of different practices and different needs of co-ops. So like what gaps do co-ops see, and sort of like how do they run their democracies, and really sort of trying to get a full, as deep of a picture view of that as we can. And so if you're out there and you have ideas for questions, we're definitely looking to really flesh this out. So you can head over to our Facebook page or send an email to coopvt or coop Vermont at spelled out Vermont at gmail.com if you have ideas for that survey.
Really stoked about that. I think that's gonna be really excellent. And I guess fitting in the theme of our show today here, covering positive stories and maybe not so positive stories, the former manager of the Border Lodge Credit Union was sentenced for embezzlement recently, sentenced to 3 years in prison. That's a small credit union, but it really underlines the importance of members being informed of what's going on
and good governance.
Right.
Yeah, that was one of those things that just kind of continues along this trend of that embezzlement put an end to the small credit union, and while the credit union presence in that area is not gone, it's sort of, if you look at this larger trend of the consolidation of the movement into fewer and fewer institutions, that one went down. There's actually an announcement of a merger between a credit union in southern Vermont and VSCCU. So, that kind of continued trend line of fewer and fewer institutions is in Vermont's ticking away. I think if we're not already there, we're getting pretty close to being in the teens. Whereas the number of individual institutions capped out at, I think, above 70 at one point. So, going from 70 to about 20, that's a really dramatic shift over a few decades.
And the consolidation will continue, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a very strong trend with a lot of factors feeding into it.
Mm-hmm. And one update that we should mention to folks: the Vermont Employee Ownership Center annual conference is coming up Tuesday, June 3rd at St. Mike's College. Mm-hmm. I haven't actually looked at their agenda this year, but they usually have an awesome agenda.
Yeah, no, they had Garl Perovitz a few years ago, and I was given the opportunity to give him a ride from his speaking gig at the conference down to I think it was Bard College, and got to talk to him for like 4 hours, which for an econ dork like me, he's probably one of the most interesting living political economists, I think. And so for me to be able to have his ear for 4 hours was quite fun.
That's a prize you could auction away, 4 hours with Garl.
But other than that, yeah, they have really great sort of workshops. There's like usually a worker co-op track and then an ESOP track, the employee stock ownership plan, which is a different form of worker ownership. So if folks are either interested in like learning the basics of worker co-ops or kind of digging in deep and really talking to people who have been there, understand a lot the challenges and understand ways to work through those, it's a very educational event. Yeah, so I think we should now move on to discussing sort of what kind of theorists of cooperation have referred to as the democratic deficit at Vermont Federal Credit Union. That's, as democratic institutions, co-ops have this high ideal to live up to,
right.
And the experiences of the last couple of years at Vermont Federal have really shown the gap between that ideal and what's real. But I figured a good way to start this conversation would be with a quote, and this is from Roy Bergengren, who is the first managing director of the Credit Union National Association, He then retired from that position to move to Vermont, where he started the Vermont Credit Union League, which then became the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. And he was involved from the early 20s until the day he died. He was doing credit union stuff. And I'm actually going to be going to his birthday is the 14th of June, and I've recently discovered where he's buried, so I'm going to be going down to pay tribute to him then to Boston. So looking forward to that. But here's the quote. This is him from the book Soul, written in 1938. "The credit union movement is a democracy. To begin with, every credit union is a democracy. The power, the ultimate power, vests in the membership meeting. Some treasurers and some boards forget this. They incline to make the membership meeting a simple process of applying annually a rubber stamp to all they do, and then to the pleasant business of having a dinner. The true democracy sees to it that the members of the democracy know what it is all about, and that they appreciate that there is no other king in a democracy except the personification of the combined will of all of its members." So, maybe we should start with why we got involved in credit unions.
Sure. For me, as I think it was you, the financial crisis of 2008 was a real sort of time to reevaluate, for sure. And it struck me, not knowing a lot about credit unions at the time, that we had, and at a time when also folks had a tough time getting capital from traditional institutions, that there are these institutions in our community owned by the community, essentially by its members, that have capital, and what a amazing economic development tool these institutions could play. So that was sort of my what got me thinking more about credit unions, and taking a deeper look. How about yourself?
So financial crisis for me too. It was something where I read an article. I was really, I think for a lot of people in our generation, really, that the whole sort of $700 billion bank bailout was this like kind of moment of clarity, where in terms of the political system, in terms of where the power lay. And that forced me to really give a lot more headspace than I had given to like, what is the financial structure? Why did this whole thing happen? Up until then I hadn't paid a huge amount of attention to it. So started doing research and read an article that mentioned the credit union model, and it just kind of clicked for me. It's like consumer-owned financial institutions. You eliminate that whole, like a lot of those agency issues if people own their own financial institution. So pretty early on, that really sort of struck a chord with me, and I think it was late 2008, maybe early 2009. I sort of decided I was going to move my money to a credit union. I was a member of City Markets and was familiar with the cooperative structure through there. That was kind of my introduction to the cooperative model of City Market in Burlington. And the ATM at City Market is a Vermont Federal ATM, and they have a signable sign there that says "Your Financial Co-op."
Yep.
So, with an endorsement from an institution that I trust, I moved my money from Citizens Bank, who I found out was owned by Royal Bank of Scotland and had received enormous amounts of bailout money and was one of the greatest criminals in the whole sort of fiasco.
Right.
I moved my money to Vermont Federal Credit Union and enthusiastically went around to everyone in my social group and was like to all my friends, you should join. Come on, join Vermont Federal. Come into the credit union movement. This is the solution to the problem. And I went to a few annual meetings. I never really got involved in the governance early on. I was just sort of curious. And again, with City Market being kind of my template for this is how a co-op works. They have these big annual meetings, they have brunch, and they have competitive elections, and it's a really sort of powerful community event.
Right.
Attended but usually by hundreds of people. And so I just sort of assumed that kind of same spirit of cooperation was present at Vermont Federal, especially given that relationship was what led me there with City Market was what led me there in the first place. And so when things really, so I continued studying credit unions and cooperation, and then when kind of Occupy happened. That was kind of a real moment when a lot of people came together and were having this conversation about really the things, we as a society, I think we're still processing what had happened in 2008. And that was a moment for people to talk about that. And of course, I saw that as a great opportunity to spread the credit union message. I went out and had a sign, and encouraged people again to sign up for credit unions, the whole move your money thing, and then the bank transfer day thing happened. So I was like, okay, this is great. Now, but I'm involved. I'm encouraging people to move in. I'm, really loyal to the credit union movement. Maybe I should take the next step and get more involved. Mm-hmm. And so, you and I and another number of other people decided we were going to, and for me, again, this was at City Market, to run for the board. They encourage people to. They go around and they're like, oh, who wants to run for the board? Please sign up. Here, you just sign this and you join and have this big competitive election. Everyone gives a little speech at the annual meeting. So I was like, oh yeah, that would be the obvious way to get involved if I want to be a volunteer. Right. I'll run for the board. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to, you decided to, a couple other people did.
Yeah, and in our group, our discussion group at the time, in looking at how institutions were living up to their claims of being democratic, it's sort of important to note that when digging into credit union democracy, there's a lot of institutions where improvements could readily be made. And we just happen to have a sort of core contingent of mm-hmm. members of Vermont Federal. Yeah. No, it's the sort of thing where everyone sort of looked around. I think looking back on it, I think it really was that City Market connection, because people who are already sort of, really thinking sort of into the co-op model, of course, would be members of City Market, and then, the ATM's right there. So of course, if I'm going to join a credit union, that's what I'm going to join. Right. So critical mass of people were involved in Vermont Federal. So we're like, okay, yeah, let's get together and we'll run a slate and we'll encourage it to get more involved in cooperative development and things like that. And initially, according to their first announcement that year, this was 2011 at that point, or 2012. Yeah. This was like the early 2012. Yep. They put out the word that, in their official announcement, which all organizations are legally required to notice a meeting. So in their notice, they said you needed 20 signatures to get on the ballot. And that seemed pretty reasonable. City Market doesn't require signatures, but 20 signatures isn't hard. Low barrier, yeah.
So we just kind of floated a petition around our friends and collected most of them. And then we posted on the Facebook page the week before the deadline, saying, hey, we're planning on running. Here's, we'll be turning our petition signatures soon. You want to learn about why we're running? Here you go. A week later, a new notice goes out to all the members saying that they'd re-examined the bylaws. And in fact, the barrier to entry was not 20 signatures, but 1% of the membership, which was 330 signatures. And so they moved the meeting back, the legal minimum amount of time necessary to because they re-noticed it to fulfill the bylaw requirements. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly we were looking at this, what we thought was a very modest barrier to accessibility to the democratic process, was suddenly a very large barrier with pretty much the absolute legal minimum amount of time necessary to complete it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, then at that point we said, oh, well, that's a lot of signatures, so, it's too many for us to collect, right? No, we went out to we started circling this petition in front of the credit union's main branch, mostly. We ventured out to other branches as well. And we started talking to members and talking about we saw opportunities to engage more members in governance and to opportunities to share more information with members.
Yeah, the platform we were putting forward was things like, again, drawing on our experience with the City Market, Onion River Co-op, make board meetings by default open to members. If a member wants to show up, of course the board can always go into executive session if it needs to do something that protects privacy, but allow members to go to board meetings. allow for absentee balloting and making the elections more accessible. Allow for members to participate in voting for where community giving dollars go. All things that were sort of rooted in the cooperative idea, just taking it a step further.
Right. So we had hundreds of conversations with members, and it's also another key point here is members having the information to do this. At the time, the bylaws weren't actually posted on the website. They were soon after.
It was the sort of thing where, when I went in to the branch, I was like, okay, well, in order to know how this process works, I need to have the actual bylaws. So I went into the branch. I asked the teller, oh, can I have a copy of the bylaws? The what? The teller had no idea that there were bylaws, never mind that as a member I had the right to them. Yep. So I went to the manager didn't know, kind of went up the chain. And we were also, and this was the sort of thing too, where we were also, at City Market, we had this experience of, being welcomed, and people were welcomed or just actively recruited into the process. There would be people I was like in a class. The City Market puts on different classes, so I was taking a class on how to can vegetables. And then one of the board members showed up to that class to encourage people at the class to run, that level of outreach.
Right.
Whereas we ran into pretty much active hostility from the management from as soon as we started petitioning. The CEO, a few days after we started petitioning, the CEO, Bernie Isabel, came down or asked to talk to me. And he really sort of, in the conversation, the point that I made was that he tried to frame it as if this was us trying, insulting them and saying, if you're trying to run, that means because we're not doing our job. But coming from a democratic culture at City Market, no, competitive elections are par for the course. Everyone sort of who is interested and has an idea can throw their hat in the ring, and then it's up to the members to decide in a democracy who they want to represent them. But sort of he got very was very skeptical and very sort of opposed to even having that first competitive election.
I had a similar conversation as well, that on the first day of petitioning, and I guess there's a thought that if you're wanting to get engaged, you must have an issue with what's occurring at the time, and the reverse was true for me, that I liked what the credit union was doing and wanted to sort of share, my expertise and my perspective. And that's sort of, I guess, another sort of barrier that's there in terms of opportunity to participate in governance.
So, we ultimately, after initially having the management try to dissuade us from running at all, once we made it clear that, no, we were going to run, we decided on specific places where they were okay with us collecting petition signatures. And so we spent the next several weeks putting a lot of time and really having, as you mentioned before, hundreds of conversations with members. Yeah. Collecting their petition signatures, telling them about what we wanted to change in the credit union, with pretty much universal positive responses. I think I got maybe 3 people who were, at least 2 of whom were employees of the credit union who were opposed to it. But the rest of the people I talked to were like, yes, I would love it if, the board meeting minutes were posted online and that was open to members and we had a vote for Democratic and I could vote absentee. Yeah, oh, wow, a lot of people didn't even realize they could vote. They didn't even realize it was supposed to be a democracy.
Yeah, and, many employees, too, were very supportive. One member that we had a conversation with, invited us to dinner at his home to share this message with others. So I think the conversations that we had with members were amazing. That was something I really enjoyed about that process.
So then we all collected between 350 and 400 signatures, turned them in, and then it turned out that so they went through line by line and disqualified basically every signature that They couldn't, fully verify. They disqualified everyone who's a secondary account holder, which is, this is another issue that I think is a deeper democratic issue, where if more secondary account holders are women than men, you have a disproportionate amount of representation between genders within the credit union. But they really kind of went through line by line, rather than sort of, again, being in this inclusive mode of saying, hey, more participation is better, we want to build that, like City Market does. They were really sort of putting a lot of energy into trying to be exclusive about the process.
Well, and the secondary members point, you bring up a good point with that. And another problem is that those secondary members, they thought that they were sort of full members,
when they signed, they believed that they had the right to sign, and that they had, full voting rights in the democracy that is the credit union. But so they went through line by line and ended up disqualifying 2 of our 4 candidates as a result, and the last 2 just sort of barely squeaked through in a very tense meeting. So now it was two candidates from us, and then the 4 incumbents. And then the next thing that happened, which was quite odd, which actually this ended up being something that got the legal system involved, was one of the incumbent board members passed away. And they didn't actually inform us of this for several weeks afterwards. We learned of it through other means because we had people, sort of sympathetic people, who were able to sort of tell us this, but they never informed us until we got a phone call, and they said, this has happened, and we've decided that we're going to hold that seat out of the election until after the election. Then the board will vote as to who fills it, right? Which, if a quick reading of the bylaws showed to be completely against against what the actual rules were. Mm-hmm. The rules say if there are more qualified candidates than seats, then there are no candidates may be qualified for the floor, but that seat is open.
Right. And if there weren't as many candidates, then there would be an opportunity there for members to nominate from the floor by the bylaws. Right.
Yeah. So it was essentially an attempt to, rather than suddenly we were in a position where mathematically we would be guaranteed a seat, it was an attempt to subvert the rules, subvert the process, subvert the democracy, in order to maintain the monopoly of this kind of incumbent group on power. So fortunately, we had a volunteer supporter who was a lawyer and helped us navigate the National Credit Union Administration, which is the regulatory system. And there's a lot of back and forth. It got pretty heated. But at the 11th hour, the decision came down from the regulator that indeed what they were trying to do was not legitimate, and that if they did it, that the election would be overturned by the regulator.
Right.
So literally, when I walked into that election, I didn't know whether I would see vote for 3 or vote for 4 on those ballots.
Same.
And when I saw vote for 4 when I walked in, there was such a sense of justice and relief. And that was how you got on the board of Vermont Federal.
Right. Yeah.
It was that meeting was somewhat contentious. There's a big discussion over whether or not executive compensation should be disclosed. Really, it was, they got a bigger room than they'd gotten. It was the largest annual meeting probably in living memory in terms of participation, and it was, definitely a qualified victory where now suddenly the democratic process was moving again.
Right. Yeah. I don't think we've ever officially got an answer on this, but it had been some time since the last competitive election, and that was the first time where members got to express their vote on who would represent them.
So do you want to talk a little bit about your experience as a board member between when you were elected and the subsequent annual meeting?
Sure. So my experience was at a board as a board member was interesting because that whole process, was very sort of confrontational. That whole initial process, and my perspective on sitting at the boardroom table and sort of working with this with these folks was definitely different. And there were educational opportunities as well. So ultimately, I enjoyed my time on the board and working with these folks. But I think it's clear that mainly in the process, it has very little to do with the current board or management, but more in the democratic process at the credit union. There are opportunities to bring in more member input and to sort of develop that sense of members as owners of the institution.
So when you did bring up some of these strategies or some of these opportunities, what was the response you got from the rest of the board?
Well, I don't really want to get too much in the details because they are confidential meetings, but none of them did pass. So, extrapolate from that.
Mm-hmm. So then, we had a year, and there's something that I initially interpreted, as the next election was coming, that I interpreted as like a positive step forward, was that there's actually an announcement put out by the nominating committee asking for applicants or for people to apply. Right. And it was not like a very well publicized announcement. In fact, it was just in an internet newsletter in a PDF file that I found because I was looking for it. But when I went into a branch to look for it, there was before the deadline, a few weeks before the deadline, there was still the old newsletters that didn't have the announcement were the newsletters that were in the branch. So again, I went to the teller. I asked about it. The teller didn't know. The teller brought me over to the branch manager. The branch manager didn't know. The branch manager called the marketing department. The person in the marketing department didn't know. So 3 levels of the organization weren't aware that this process was open. Nonetheless, sort of from that pressure, then there was an announcement made on social media. And there was one member who I had never met, but who commented that she was going to be putting her application in. And myself and one other person who I know, Debbie Krug, who's currently finishing up her degree at Community Development and Applied Economics at UVM, also put in our applications. So there are at least three that we know of member applications that went into the nominating committee. And so this was a hopeful thing. I was thinking, okay, well, maybe they've learned their lesson from this last one. They're going to sort of start taking democracy, democratic participation, competitive elections a little bit more seriously. Again, City Market does competitive elections every year, and the nominating committee recruits and puts everyone on the ballot. Then we all got letters of rejection, and the nominating committee decided to go with the status quo, only nominated the two incumbents and did not nominate anyone else, despite having a number of other applicants. And this was also the 60th anniversary. So they're throwing a big sort of annual meeting party. So it's going to be a much bigger annual meeting than normal. I think there were something like 270 some members at that in attendance.
It was close to 300.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was a big room, dinner, and then meeting. And so we went to that. And we raised the resolution from the floor, essentially calling out the fact that this whole room had the election process was simply the board instructing the secretary to cast one vote for all the candidates. So despite the fact you had this room full of members, there was no opportunity for any meaningful member participation. It was simply, as that Roy Bergengren quote talked about earlier, it was simply a rubber stamp and then the dinner.
Unless members were to raise interesting proposals.
Yes, and so we raised a resolution that called on the nominating committee, instructed the nominating committee in the future to accept all applications from legally qualified candidates and include them on the ballot. And this is with precedent. I mean, pretty much that's what City Market does with a few exceptions. And Washington Electric Co-op, actually, their nominating committee is a committee on candidates where it is tasked with simply verifying that someone is legally qualified to run and then puts them on the ballot. Mm-hmm. So put that forward. There was very spirited debate. You were actually sitting on, you were able to see the whole crowd sitting on the dais with the other board members. What was your take on that debate?
It was very spirited, but it was overwhelmingly folks supporting an opportunity to participate in the process. And, the vast majority of these folks we had never met before. But when the issue was raised that, they didn't have an opportunity to participate this year, I don't think that sat very well with most of them.
Mm-hmm. And we also someone raised the question of, so when was the last competitive election? And the only thing they could think of was to say, last year, because we had petitioned. But
Facilitated
truly,
by the membership.
Yeah, there's, some of those board members have been on for decades, and none of them, when confronted with that, none of them could remember ever having a competitive election, ever. And so really, that was kind of, I think, a pretty, as that conversation, as a lot of this stuff came out to people, and this was something where the majority of people in the room, in this case, were rank and file members, not employees, not activists, just rank and file members who had come because there's a dinner, and all right, hey, this should be interesting, maybe I'll learn something, but so they really didn't have a previous dog in the fight. And so it kind of went back and forth, lots of people speaking up, and then a vote was taken. And the board voted 6-1 against the resolution. The membership voted by, they didn't take exact numbers, it was done by a standing vote, by a very substantial majority for the resolution. So the resolution passed. And so it was this moment of very clearly and publicly demonstrating the disconnect between the board and the membership.
It would appear as if the resolution passed at the annual meeting.
Yes. However, because the resolution was instructing, under the and despite the spirit again when that Roy Bergengren quote that we were talking about earlier, of the members meeting being the kind of foundation of the whole institution of the credit union and the democracy of the credit union. They lawyered up and actually received a several-page letter outlining the legal justification by which they could ignore this resolution because the membership can only vote in an advisory fashion, and so the vote was non-binding, and therefore they could do whatever they wanted. And so, but it was something where that vote kind of pushed them, sort of clearly demonstrated something where if you have closed board meetings where you never know how any board member votes or acts on a particular issue, how do members know if the board members are representing their interests or not? So that member meeting, that one public sort of meeting a year is the only place where the positions of the board members becomes a public thing. And so in that moment, you could sort of see very visibly that disconnect between the leadership of the credit union and the rank and file membership.
Yeah, I would agree.
So we rolled. You had one more year on your term. So were there any sort of developments in the year between that and the most recent annual meeting that you feel like were relevant to bring up?
I think that with my where I have not so good feelings about the credit union, it's definitely in the process, and I don't question everyone sort of sitting around that boardroom table is very dedicated to the institution and qualified. I just think there's a lot of opportunities to actually build that sense among members that they are owners, and that if that's not done, that's a missed opportunity for me. So I think the process is really the important piece.
So that brings us to a few weeks ago, which is the 2014 annual meeting. So in spite of so your seat was one of the ones that was up.
A competitive election was facilitated this year.
Yep, so there are 3 candidates for 2 seats. And so we went in and, all right, there's going to be a competitive election. And, went in, had some finger food, chatted with lots of people I had either seen only a handful of times in the past year,
Nice.
It was good to kind of get caught up. Then I picked up the annual meeting minutes from the last year, which every year has to approve the meeting minutes from the previous year.
Right.
And I have read a lot of annual meeting minutes because I wrote my master's thesis on the history of the VSECU, Vermont State Employees Credit Union, which consisted of a lot of reading board meeting minutes and a lot of from mid-1940s to the mid-1970s and annual meeting minutes.
And from those minutes, you were able to sort of reconstruct what was happening within the institutions at that time.
That was a lot of work, but I am after that process, I am both very familiar with annual meeting minutes and very appreciative of their importance and value as a historic document. Because what it does is it communicates what happens, what decisions were made, what was important, and where there were controversies, where there was disagreement. And in order to, from looking back 50 years, that's important. But even looking back 1 year or 2 years, where if you're a member trying to decide who you want representing you, those documents, the annual meeting minutes, are the resource available to show you kind of the decisions and positions taken by your leadership. So I sat down, I picked up the minutes, started reading through them, and then I realized that they had purposefully omitted basically all of the useful information about the whole debate and vote at the previous annual meeting. They simply mentioned that they give the text of the resolution, mention that it was voted on, and that's it. There's no mention of how the outcome of the vote, and more importantly, there was no mention of how the board members voted. And to me, this omission was Orwellian. Like in George Orwell's 1984, he who controls the past controls the future. This was writing out of their official institutional history the record of the behavior of the board and the record of a decision collectively made by the members that future members looking back on trying to understand what's happened in the credit union in order to make their own decisions in the present are now when they look at that, they do not have the relevant information.
And of course, a lot of the same people weren't at the annual meeting this year. The previous one was sort of a milestone celebration. So they weren't able to sort of participate in that discussion again of not being reflected in the minutes.
Right. And so, I obviously, because the minutes have to be approved by the meeting, I brought this fact up, and I proposed simply that the relevant information that should be part of the historical record of this institution, because it was a decision made by the member meeting, should be recorded in the minutes. And also the votes of the board should be recorded in the minutes so that individual board members are accountable for their positions, whether people agree with them or disagree with them. If the U.S. Congress never published their voting records, how could you possibly know who to vote for? This is the same sort of thing. And when the vote happened, there's a voice vote. It was indeterminate as to who won that vote. So they went to hands, and it was narrowly defeated with all the board members except for you voting against it. So and now that you are off the board, and we're not sure how the other board member voted, but we know at least the super majority of the board was opposed to a valid and accurate recording of its own history and an accountability and taking accountability for their own actions at the last meeting. They did not want those actions recorded in the official meeting minutes.
And the members present also voted against that resolution, which is important, and it gets at are there enough members there, perspectives for membership to really make a decision that really reflects the membership.
Mm-hmm. And I spoke to a former employee who was at the meeting and was sort of observing. And what was interesting about this meeting is this wasn't the 60th anniversary big kind of thing. So it was a much smaller group of members. And there's an interesting power dynamic there, which is that if you're voting publicly, voting kind of in favor of the incumbent leadership, if you're raising your hand and you're a lower level employee looking to be seen positively by your bosses and thinking about your career and behaving rationally, voting kind of the way that you are pretty sure that your bosses want you to vote is a really great way of showing your loyalty and showing your reliability. And sort of this employee who I was talking to was sort of kind of had a pretty good sense that dynamic was at play in the meeting, and the employees were at that point, because it was a smaller meeting, a substantial block of the votes. But it was also, again, it was a very close vote, and there was a lot of sort of disbelief from a lot of the rank and file members about its outcome, because it's clearly sort of, hey, let's have an accurate recording of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you don't even really need to sort of be sure of how your boss is potentially voting, because it's a show of hands. So you can see that, and they can also see that as well.
Right. And so that was stunning. There's this very Orwellian turn of this leadership is not only has shown its willingness to sort of bend the rules to the point the regulator has to get involved in earlier elections, but they've also shown that they're willing to erase history and to sort of not record their own positions. So that was like a kind of stunning moment. And then we moved on from there to some reports and the elections. And then we moved to eventually got to new business, which gets to sort of the point you raised earlier of, okay, how, if you have an institution with like 35,000 members or so, and you have maybe 80 in the room, how can that sort of self-selected group of people who can meet at that particular time, and with employees being encouraged to go, and the schedule being perhaps even built around, at least one of the years, they closed all the branches an hour early to allow the employees to attend the annual meeting. So when you have that sort of self-selection in terms of the electorate that's there, how do you make that more accessible and have that process accessible to everyone? Now, again, sort of to bring in the example of City Market has an elections period, which is a certain amount of time that you're allowed to vote. You can log on to a website, you can go to a little terminal in the store, you can vote actually at the annual meeting itself. But they essentially have this system that allows them to, that's an absentee ballot system that allows every member who wants to participate can participate in this really important decision, even if the fact that they have to pick up their kids after work and they're working 2 jobs means that they can't actually make it physically to the annual meeting. So I raised a proposal from the floor, saying the members advise the board of directors to institute an absentee voting system, which under the bylaws they are authorized to do.
Yeah, you did raise that. And that was actually the most shocking moment for me, is when the vote on that came. The credit union is an institution of 30,000 plus people, 35,000 on paper, but some people get counted twice. 30,000 people, and let's be generous. Say there were 90 people there. That's a 0.3 participation rate, and also if you need to be present to vote, you're excluding a lot of people that maybe just doesn't fit into their work hours. Maybe they don't have reliable transportation.
Geographically, the credit union has a branch in Middlebury and has a branch in St. Albans.
Right.
And the meeting was in South Burlington.
Maybe they couldn't get childcare. Maybe it was on a holy evening and they had to go to church.
And it was actually during Holy Week for Catholics. I know of at least one person who wasn't able to attend specifically because he felt spiritually obligated to go to Mass, and he tried to come. He came early, asked if he could cast his ballot before the meeting started so that he could make it to church. They told him no, and so then he had to, because of his faith, he had to go to church and wasn't able to participate in the election.
It'd be really useful to the credit union to include these people in the process and develop among those members that this is my credit union, that I have a stake, and the more that can be opened up, that I see so many opportunities there. So when the meeting voted pretty overwhelmingly, not too overwhelmingly, but it was close. It
first went to a voice vote, and the chair wasn't able to determine the outcome from a voice vote. So
right.
that says it's close. But then it was, and then when he went to the standing vote, it was, and again it was this very sort of twisted, weird situation in which the handful of people who, for various reasons, including working for the credit union, were able to make it to the annual meeting, voted to disenfranchise all of the rest of the members, which, essentially saying, we don't want you who has to work nights because you have 2 shifts. Like, we don't want you to be able to participate in this decision. We want to monopolize this decision for ourselves
through that voting.
Yes,
process.
through that vote. Yeah. So that was really discouraging. And even the way the election was run, it got almost comical at times because people walked in and some people were handed 1 ballot and some people were handed 2 ballots and a few people were handed 3 ballots. And the people running the election, the actual voting itself, were confused enough by what was going on with that when it came time to vote, they actually had to huddle around the secretary for a good, 5 or 10 minutes while they figured out what they were doing. It was very odd.
That process was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess this was the second competitive election in some time. So when those processes aren't put into play, there's going to be some unfamiliarity with them.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, the outcome of that was, a lot of people I've talked to who are actually in attendance left extremely disgusted with the process, including a number of people who, for whom that was their first experience. Which
that shouldn't be the way you come away from an annual meeting.
Right.
Feeling.
I mean, in the ideal situation, the credit unions and cooperatives in general, function as schools of democracy. This is one of the few places in our economy where people can come together and, have a say. You go into the for-profit bank and that you're not empowered. It's the wealthy shareholders who, who can make all the real decisions, and you're basically at their whims. The credit union is supposed to be this more free space where you have a stake, you're an owner, you're an equal. But sort of the way that this has unfolded over the last 3 years really has shown how far Vermont Federal is from that ideal.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with that sentiment, and it is important to note, though, sort of tying back to when we were starting this process, and the group that assembled was overwhelmingly Vermont Federal members. This sort of atrophy of the democratic process is not unique to one institution. It's pretty prevalent in the industry. I think. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point to make. Vermont Federal is the one that we have personally experienced because, we started off as city market members who joined because there's the ATM in my case, and people sort of coming into it because we believe in the credit union movement. We believe in the idea. We believe in what it can accomplish. That ideal of economic democracy, that ideal of owning our own financial system, is really inspiring. But you look, and so the credit union we decided to get involved in turned out to really be far from those ideals. But there's a lot of credit unions for whom that has been the case. And so stepping back, I think that our experience might be a canary in the coal mine for a deeper sort of structural democratic crisis in the credit union movement. And I think we've seen that in some of the conversations we've had with folks since we started down this path. The organizing going on in the Washington, D.C. area right now.
Yeah, that's huge. The Lafayette Federal Credit Union, if you go on FCU Times and Google them, they're doing some amazing organizing. But some of them reached out to us because they'd heard about our experience. It got written up in Credit Union Times and such not. And they're at their credit union, the annual meeting is held in a country club with a dress code, far from any sort of reasonable mass transit, which makes it highly geographically inaccessible. They had security called on one of their members who was trying to collect petition signatures. That's another example of this kind of entrenched anti-democratic leadership really sort of taking a group of people who are excited about the credit union idea, who want to get involved, who want to be part of really helping it realize its potential, and just doing everything in their power to repress that. And
even one of our fellow core folks at Cooperative Vermont, super uber qualified, and saw our story and said, I wonder what my credit union is like in this, and contacted his credit union and said, hey, I'd like to run for the board, and it was communicated to him, we don't really encourage that sort of thing. So it is prevalent.
Yeah, and so taking a step back and thinking why this is, we've only got a couple minutes left in the show, but I think it's important to sort of lay this out. I'll actually start with another sort of quote from Roy Bergengren. This is again from the same book, 1938. As we increase and multiply and grow in strength and in power, as our accumulation becomes increasingly great and our army swells to many millions, there will be those who cannot refrain from attempting our exploitation. We shall be told that we must employ experts for this and that we must delegate to those who might exploit us the opportunity for such exploitation. We must not get lost to accountants and lawyers and bankers. We must not become prone to call in professionals who, not knowing how to think credit union-wise, will drag into our councils all of the bad thinking on which so many professional thinkers are trained. It's one of those things where you look at the trends in the credit union movement since 1970, really, when the NCUA was founded, the major regulator. The number of credit unions in the country, if you look at it on a trend line, was going up until that point, started trending down afterwards. You see this kind of development of relationship between the regulator, who has this, who prefers to deal with a few professionalized institutions rather than many democratic institutions, because they're predictable. Democracy is unpredictable. That makes headaches for a regulator. Right. Regulators' workload's a lot easier if they're not having to deal with a different cast of characters every few years, even if it's the best thing for the institution. And in the same way, you have this sort of professionalization where the prerogatives and a manager gets paid more for managing a $1 billion credit union than a $100 million credit union, so they can kind of set agendas for growth that might not actually be in the best interest of the membership. But if there's no democracy, if the board has no feedback loop with membership, the management can just by default set the priorities.
To touch on a perspective from inside the credit union movement, a lot of businesses take a lot of effort and a lot of money to develop sort of loyalty among those who use their services. And as credit unions being cooperatives, that's already built in to the bylaws through the democratic process, is that ability to develop a sense of ownership in the organization. And if we don't take advantage of that, that's a big missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost out of time on the show, but this odyssey is far from over. So if you want to get involved, of course, always come to the Cooperative Vermont Facebook page, where we cover the cooperative movement, both in its incredible potential to do amazing things, but also in its warts and failings.
Critique it as well.
Yep, that's important if we're going to build a strong movement for economic democracy in this state. But until next episode, I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Good night.